1974. A quiet town in the American South. 9-year-old Jessica clutched a worn-out ribbon in her hair, staring at the cracked linoleum floor of her tiny kitchen. Her birthday wish was simple, almost laughably so: a cassette of Elvis Presley's songs. Money was tight. Her mother worked double shifts, and the idea of a luxury gift was as distant as the moon. But that day, the air seemed to hum with possibility, as if the universe itself had paused to listen. Across town, a stranger overheard a fleeting conversation in the corner store. A whisper of hope disguised as longing. Unseen threads began to pull lives together in ways no one could anticipate. That tiny, fragile desire in Jessica's heart, so pure, so innocent, was about to set off a chain of events that would reach the king of rock and roll himself. One moment of generosity, one cassette, one dream. And suddenly, nothing in her world, or his, would ever be the same. In the shadow of poverty and quiet despair, a miracle waited to unfold. And when it did, it would sweep through her life like the roar of a stadium, leaving no room for ordinary ever again. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The morning sunlight seeped through the thin curtains of the small living room, painting golden streaks across the worn wooden floor. Jessica sat on the edge of the couch, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap, fingers twisting the frayed edges of her faded dress. It had once been white, stitched neatly by her grandmother, but now the fabric was dotted with pale stains and subtle tears, remnants of countless washes and years of careful wear. Her blue ribbon, the one she had chosen herself for this special day, was the only decoration that made her feel like a princess, and it nestled in her tightly braided hair with proud defiance against the modesty of their home. She stared at the clock on the wall, its tick loud and heavy in the quiet of the room, and for the 100th time that morning whispered the same wish under her breath. Please, let it be Elvis. 9 years old. A number that felt enormous to Jessica, though her small frame and shy demeanor often made her feel like a shadow among the bustling adults of her town. Birthdays in the Johnson household were simple affairs, a fleeting acknowledgement of the passage of time. Her mother, Margaret, had been up since before dawn, tending to the small stove that had served the family for decades, stirring a thick, cinnamon-spiced batter for the single birthday cake Jessica would have. It was a humble creation, a slightly lopsided sponge, dusted with powdered sugar, its sweet aroma filling the cramped kitchen with the rare scent of celebration. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at Jessica, her own blue-rimmed eyes softened by a mixture of love and quiet sorrow. Money was scarce. Between her 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and sewing dresses for neighbors by night, there was no room for indulgence, let alone the shiny, alluring world of records and toys that Jessica's classmates often enjoyed. Even the store-bought gifts for birthdays seemed like whispers from another life, one where financial worry did not accompany every small decision. The thought of disappointing her daughter a second year in a row pressed heavily against Margaret's chest. She wanted, more than anything, to make this day feel magical. I just wish for one thing, Mom," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling not from fear, but from the intensity of her longing. She held up the tiny piece of paper on which she had written her birthday wish, Elvis Presley's new album on tape. That's all, just a cassette. She imagined listening to it for hours, the raw warmth of his voice filling the quiet corners of their small home, the kind of joy money could never buy but music somehow made possible. Margaret's heart ached. She wanted to believe it could happen. She hugged Jessica tightly, her own tears threatening to spill as she whispered, "I'll try, baby. I'll try." She ventured into the small, dimly lit shop at the corner, a place filled with the scent of vinyl and dust, lined with narrow shelves burdened by rows of records and tapes. Behind the counter, Mr. Henley, the elderly store owner, gave her a skeptical glance as she leaned over, whispering her desperate request. "Could you set aside the last Elvis tape for my little girl? Please, I'll come back for it after lunch." Her heart soared with a fragile hope as Mr. Henley nodded, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the glass. But fate had other plans. As Margaret turned to leave, she didn't notice the man lingering by the counter, a stranger with sharp eyes and a well-worn coat, who had overheard every word. His fingers brushed against the last tape on the shelf as a slow, calculating smile spread across his face. By the time Margaret returned with her change, the last piece of Jessica's dream had already vanished from the store, purchased by someone who didn't even know the girl who needed it most. The return home was quiet. Jessica tried to hide her disappointment beneath a small, polite smile, but Margaret could see through it. They arranged the simple cake on the chipped table, placing a single candle in its center. The soft flicker of the flame reflected in Jessica's wide blue eyes as she closed her hands tightly around it, making her birthday wish in secret. The tiny kitchen smelled sweet and warm, but an invisible weight pressed down on Jessica's small shoulders. The absence of the one gift she truly desired, the one that seemed to hold a piece of her heart. Her brothers and cousins sat around the table, unwrapping scraps of colored paper to reveal small trinkets: a tin whistle, a set of mismatched crayons, a hand-painted notebook. Jessica smiled politely, clapping as each gift was presented, but inside, her mind replayed the melody she longed to hear. Outside, the late morning sun climbed higher, spilling across the town's dusty streets. The world felt enormous and distant to a small girl in a faded dress, one who had learned early that dreams could be fragile, easily lost in the shuffle of life's pressing realities. Just as the last crumb of cake was eaten, Margaret placed a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder and whispered, "I haven't given up yet." Her eyes were serious, fierce with determination, but also shadowed with uncertainty. Jessica's heart fluttered. Maybe there was still a chance. Perhaps this day, this simple birthday without gifts, might yet surprise her in ways she could never imagine. And in the quiet of that small kitchen, filled with the hum of the world outside and the lingering scent of sugar and cinnamon, a fragile ember of hope flickered, as though the universe itself had paused, listening, waiting, for the moment when a small girl's wish might just come true. Outside, the streets of the sleepy southern town carried on with their routine. Birds sang unnoticed, wind brushed the long, sun-drenched grass, and the distant whistle of a train hinted at journeys not yet taken. Inside, Jessica held her tiny hands together, the blue ribbon in her hair a banner of quiet determination. The world had given her a day of scarcity, of waiting. But somehow, it felt as though something extraordinary was quietly beginning to unfold. A story that would stretch far beyond the walls of this modest home, beyond the limits of her imagination, into a life-changing adventure that none could yet foresee. The next morning, the sunlight seemed different somehow, spilling softer through the thin curtains. Jessica sat at the edge of the same worn couch, her blue ribbon slightly askew after a restless night of anticipation. The echoes of yesterday's small celebration lingered in her mind. The sweet taste of cake, the flickering candlelight, the warmth of her mother's determined smile. But nothing had changed outside. No Elvis tape rested on the shelf. No miracle had come yet. She folded her hands and whispered another wish under her breath, almost afraid to hope too loudly. Please, let it be real. Margaret, sensing her daughter's quiet longing, was up early again, humming softly as she tidied the kitchen. Her movements were brisk but careful, like a woman balancing urgency and the weight of years spent making miracles out of nothing. She had barely sat down with a cup of weak coffee when a knock at the door startled her. It was early. Too early for any neighbor, too early for the mail. Jessica's heart leapt as she raced to the door, her small feet tapping across the floorboards. She found herself staring at a man she had never seen before. He was tall, with a kind but determined face, and his eyes held a softness that made her wonder if he understood what it meant to wait for a dream. In his hands, wrapped carefully in brown paper and tied with a thin string, was a small package. He smiled gently at Jessica, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "This is for you," he said, handing over the package with the reverence of someone offering something sacred. His voice had a calm authority, yet underneath it lingered the faintest quiver of something personal, as though he, too, believed in the magic of giving. Jessica's hands shook as she took it, feeling the weight of possibility within that small parcel. Margaret appeared behind her daughter, eyes wide, unsure whether to trust this unexpected benefactor. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Just someone who thinks wishes should come true when they matter most," the man replied lightly, almost as if speaking the words aloud could make them real. "I heard you wanted something very special. I hope this helps." Jessica tore at the paper with frantic fingers. Inside lay a cassette tape, the very one she had imagined countless times. Her breath caught, and she felt as though the world had tilted just for her. But that was not all. Beneath the tape lay a small, folded card. With trembling hands, she unfolded it to reveal 2 words written in bold, precise letters. Memphis Concert. A ticket. A real ticket. To see Elvis Presley live. Jessica's eyes widened so far, it was a miracle they didn't fall out of her head. She pressed the tape to her chest, then clutched the ticket as if it were the most fragile, priceless thing she had ever held. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She turned to the stranger, searching his face for signs of trickery, but found none. Instead, she found patience, a quiet understanding that made her wonder how someone could know a child's deepest desire and respond with such exactness. I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you—" The man shrugged, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Some things, you just know when they belong to the right person. This is meant for her." He nodded toward Jessica, who was staring at the cassette as if seeing it for the first time, and then slowly backed away, tipping his hat in a polite farewell. Without another word, he left, the soft click of the door sealing a moment that already felt like destiny. Jessica sank to the floor, clutching the tape and the ticket as if she could hold the magic inside her hands. The reality of what had happened began to sink in, but with it came a shadow of doubt. "Mom, do you think we could—" Her voice trembled, a mixture of excitement and fear. Margaret knelt beside her daughter, taking the ticket into her own hands. She studied it carefully. It was unlike any ticket she had ever seen, printed individually, with neat handwriting across the bottom. "For the child who truly deserves to see the king." Her heart skipped. This wasn't just luck. Someone had gone out of their way for her child. But the practical side of her mind pulled her back. A trip to Memphis meant gas money, food, lodging, expenses that did not exist in their tight, careful budget. She swallowed hard, caught between the promise of a miracle and the harsh realities of poverty. Jessica pressed her face to the tape. I can't believe this is real, she whispered, her small shoulders shaking with emotion. The music she had longed to hear now felt tangible, almost breathing in her hands. She could imagine the lights of the stage, the warmth of the crowd, the way Elvis's voice would wrap around her heart. She could feel it all before it even happened. Margaret placed her hand over her daughter's. I think we have a choice to make. It's not easy, Jessica. But some dreams, they only come once. We have to decide if we're brave enough to chase them. Her eyes glistened with tears, reflecting both fear and hope. Jessica looked up, her wide blue eyes shining. I want to go, she said, voice barely audible but filled with a determination that belied her years. I have to. I can't. I just can't not go. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself a smile, hesitant but genuine. She nodded slowly. Then we'll find a way. Somehow, we'll find a way. Outside, the sunlight seemed brighter, the shadows of their small home less oppressive. It was the quiet before a storm of excitement, the calm at the edge of a whirlwind that would carry them to a place they had only dreamed of. Jessica clutched the tape and ticket to her chest, already humming the first notes of an Elvis song under her breath. She could not yet know the trials, the near misses, or the small miracles that awaited her on the road to Memphis, but for this moment, hope had arrived, tangible and undeniable, in the hands of a stranger who understood that some wishes were worth more than anything money could buy. The morning air was heavy with heat and the smell of asphalt. Jessica could hardly contain herself, bouncing on the balls of her feet as her mother loaded the trunk of their old car. It was a battered Ford. The green paint faded to a dull olive, and the engine groaned whenever they started it, as though warning them it had its own limits. But today, none of that mattered. Today, the car was their vessel of hope, a tiny vessel carrying a 9-year-old girl toward a dream she had whispered into the quiet corners of her heart. Margaret carefully placed the cassette tape in a small cloth bag, tucking the precious Elvis music where it wouldn't get crushed. She glanced at her daughter, whose eyes sparkled with a mix of fear and excitement. "We'll be okay, Jess," she said, trying to infuse her voice with confidence she didn't fully feel. "We just have to take it 1 mile at a time." The engine coughed and coughed, then finally settled into a hesitant hum as they pulled onto the sun-baked highway. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibilities, cutting through fields of tall grass and the occasional cluster of wooden farmhouses. Jessica pressed her forehead against the car window, watching the scenery blur into green and gold, feeling like the world had expanded just for her. She hummed a melody from the tape, the soft notes of Elvis filling the car before they had even played the cassette. Her small voice trembled but carried joy, and Margaret couldn't help but smile at her daughter's uncontainable happiness. The journey was not without challenges. The fuel gauge hovered near empty, the tires were thin and worn, and the old car shuddered over every pothole. At times, the engine would stutter, forcing Margaret to pull to the side of the road and wrestle with the stubborn metal beast. Each time, Jessica's small hands would grip the edge of the seat, holding on to hope like a lifeline, whispering encouragements she didn't fully understand but felt necessary. Come on, you can do it." By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, the heat shimmering off the asphalt. Margaret wiped her forehead with a ragged cloth, her arms aching from turning the wheel through the miles of unrelenting countryside. Jessica leaned back, exhausted but exhilarated, her fingers clutching the tape as though it were a treasure chest holding the heart of her dreams. They were closer now. Memphis was on the horizon. But the city still felt distant, suspended like a promise above the wavering heat waves. Then, as if to test their determination, the car gave a sudden, terrifying lurch and coughed violently before shuddering to a complete stop on the roadside. Margaret's stomach sank. She tried the ignition again and again, but the engine only groaned and fell silent. Jessica froze, her hands tightening on the tape, eyes wide as the reality of failure hovered over them like a dark cloud. "Mom, we can't. We're not going to make it." Her voice cracked, heavy with tears that were already forming. Margaret put a steadying hand on her daughter's shoulder, trying to mask her own panic. "We'll figure it out, Jessica. There's always a way," she said, though her words felt hollow even to her own ears. The sun glared down at them, relentless and unyielding, while the highway seemed empty of help, the occasional passing car blurring too fast to see. For a moment, despair wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. Then, out of nowhere, a sleek black Cadillac appeared in the distance. Its polished surface reflected the sunlight, and the engine's smooth hum felt almost like music to their weary ears. It slowed to a stop beside them, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. Margaret instinctively shielded Jessica, unsure if the stranger was a savior or another complication. But the man raised his hands in calm reassurance. "I can help you," he said, with a warmth that cut through the heat. "Hop in, and we'll get that car of yours started again." His smile was genuine, and Jessica's heart leapt. But the real surprise came from the faint music emanating from the Cadillac's radio. A voice, unmistakable and magical, filled the space around them. It was Elvis. Clear, powerful, yet tender, singing a song that seemed to belong only to this moment. Jessica's mouth fell open. She pressed her ear against the dashboard, hardly daring to breathe. Inside the Cadillac, the stranger's hands were steady as he checked the old Ford, tweaking wires and listening to the hesitant sputtering of the engine. Margaret and Jessica could hardly keep their eyes on the task. The soft strains of Elvis's voice created a world of possibility, weaving a spell that made the heat, the miles, the exhaustion fade away. Minutes later, with a final twist and turn, the old car coughed to life, the engine roaring back with stubborn resilience. Jessica threw her arms around her mother, her small body shaking with relief and exhilaration. "We're going to Memphis. We're really going," she shouted, her voice echoing across the empty fields. The stranger gave a nod, tipping his hat with a quiet dignity, and then drove off, leaving them with the renewed hum of the Ford and a sense that something extraordinary was guiding their journey. The remaining miles felt lighter. Jessica sang along to the songs in her head, imagining herself standing in a crowd, seeing Elvis live, the lights reflecting in his eyes just for her. Each bend in the road, each passing truck, became part of a story she was living in real time. A story of faith, courage, and a dream too persistent to be denied. As the outskirts of Memphis emerged on the horizon, Margaret slowed the car, overwhelmed by a mixture of hope and apprehension. The city's skyline was distant, shimmering like a promise, yet each mile closer felt like stepping into another world entirely. Jessica pressed her forehead to the glass once more, feeling the pulse of excitement building. The tape was still clutched tightly in her hands, a tangible piece of destiny, and the ticket lay in Margaret's lap like a compass pointing toward a dream that was finally within reach. They were almost there. Almost. But the road, as it had proven already, was unpredictable, and Memphis held its own surprises for those bold enough to arrive. Little did Jessica know, the trials of that day were only the beginning. and that a night she had imagined in quiet bedrooms and whispered prayers was about to become far more extraordinary than she, or anyone, could have imagined. By the time the Ford rumbled into the outskirts of Memphis, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the distant buildings, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The city felt alive in a way that the open country had never been. Streets bustled with cars and pedestrians, voices weaving a tapestry of urgency and energy, all converging toward one central point: the concert hall where Elvis would perform that night. Margaret parked on a side street, her hands trembling slightly as she checked the ticket once more. The printed letters and numbers were neat but unfamiliar. It didn't look like any standard ticket she'd ever seen. The anxiety that had accompanied their journey returned in a cold wave. Jessica pressed herself against the window, eyes wide as she took in the throngs of fans already gathering. Banners waved from poles, hands held up signs with painted hearts, some boldly spelling out, "Elvis Lives." The air vibrated with anticipation, and the scent of fried food from street vendors competing with the more subtle notes of city life. The exhaust of cars, the faint tang of river water, the sweet aroma of hot pastries. She clutched the cassette in her small hands, feeling as if her heartbeat synchronized with the pulsating energy around her. "Mom, do you think they'll let us in?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing din. Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the entrance. "I don't know, Jess. Just let's see." They approached the main doors, a towering wooden structure adorned with bright lights, and a marquee that announced tonight's performance. The line snaked around the building, hundreds of people pressing toward the entrance, anticipation electrifying the air. At first, it seemed like a dream realized. The tickets in Margaret's hand were their golden pass. But the moment of truth revealed an unexpected challenge. The security guards, tall men with sharp eyes and clipped movements, scrutinized the ticket. Their fingers traced the unusual font, the off-center numbering, the small handwritten note in the corner. "This doesn't look right," one guard said, his voice carrying just enough doubt to make Margaret's stomach twist. "I'm not sure we can let you in with this." Jessica's eyes filled instantly with tears, the fragile hope she had carried across hundreds of miles threatening to shatter in an instant. She clutched the cassette closer, as if it could protect her from disappointment. "Please, please, it's real," she whispered, her voice quivering. Margaret felt panic rise. She gripped her daughter's shoulders, knuckles white. "We've come all this way. We can't turn back now," she said, her own voice straining against the fear of rejection. The crowd pressed in closer, unintentionally amplifying their sense of exposure. For a moment, it seemed as if all the effort, the sacrifice, and the journey might be for nothing. And then, a figure emerged from behind the throng, a staff member with a kind face and a discreet smile. He glanced at the ticket, nodded subtly, and whispered something to the security guard. A small, almost imperceptible gesture, and the tension shifted. "Wait here," the man said to Margaret and Jessica, motioning them to step aside. Minutes later he returned, leaning close to Margaret. "This ticket, it's special, reserved for a child who truly needs this tonight. The note is from Elvis himself." Margaret's mouth went dry, and Jessica could barely breathe, her tears mingling with disbelief. "For me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with wonder. "For you," the staff member confirmed. "Go ahead. Enjoy tonight. He'll be expecting you." The entrance opened, and the sounds of the crowd washed over them. The hum of excitement, the distant thrum of instruments tuning, the low murmur of fans swapping stories, all created an atmosphere that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Jessica's small hand clung to her mother's as they made their way inside, their eyes adjusting to the dramatic lighting that bathed the hall in warm, golden hues. The smell of polished wood, the faint scent of perfume and leather, and the subtle tang of cigarette smoke from older audience members created a sensory tapestry that felt both foreign and magical. Seats stretched out in a sweeping semicircle, each row packed with eager spectators. Jessica's gaze swept across the room, landing on the stage bathed in light at the far end. The anticipation was almost tangible, a living thing that seemed to vibrate through every plank of the floor and echo off the ornate walls. Every face in the audience seemed to shimmer with the same expectation she felt, but her eyes were fixed on the stage, imagining the moment when the lights would flare and the first note of Elvis's voice would pierce the air. Suddenly, a hush fell over the crowd as stagehands moved with practiced precision, the instruments gleaming under the lights. Jessica felt her heart pound against her ribs, each beat echoing the rhythm of the instruments, the crescendo building inside her chest. She imagined the sound of Elvis's guitar, the warmth of his voice, and the incredible closeness of being in the same room as the man who had captured her dreams in music. The moment of entry became nearly unbearable. Every second stretched as though the universe itself was testing their patience, but the realization settled slowly in Margaret's mind. This was no ordinary concert. This was a moment crafted for her daughter, a night where chance, faith, and generosity intersected in a way that defied explanation. She looked down at Jessica, whose eyes were wide, shining with tears and light, and whispered softly, "You're really going to see him, Jess. You're going to see Elvis." The stage lights flared, and the first chord resonated through the hall. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The journey, the doubts, the miles on the road, they had all led to this exact instant. The music swelled, vibrating in her chest and mingling with the thrill of possibility. And in that sound, she felt the promise of something extraordinary. The moment they had feared might never arrive was here. The concert had begun, and it was more magnificent, more impossible, and more real than anything Jessica had ever imagined. But little did she know, the night held surprises far beyond her dreams, and a personal connection that would change everything was just waiting for its moment to unfold. The lights dimmed further, and the hum of the crowd became a living pulse, wrapping itself around every inch of the packed concert hall. Jessica's small hands were clenched tightly in her lap, the cassette pressed against her chest as though it were a lifeline to the impossible reality before her. Her mother's hand rested gently over hers, an anchor in the sea of anticipation. Yet neither spoke, both caught in the collective breath-holding of thousands waiting for the first note. The stage seemed to glow from within, a promise of music and wonder, the instruments catching each beam of light and reflecting it back like liquid gold. Then it happened. A single electric chord sliced through the quiet, a note so pure, so commanding, that it seemed to vibrate through Jessica's bones. Her eyes widened as the sound expanded, growing richer, filling every corner of the hall. From the shadows, a figure stepped into the golden glow, and for the first time, Jessica saw him. Not the pictures in magazines, not the recordings she had played 1,000 times, but Elvis, alive and larger than life. His white jumpsuit shimmered under the lights, sequins catching the beam like tiny stars. The audience erupted in a cheer that threatened to shake the building. Yet in the middle of it all, Jessica felt as if she existed in a bubble of quiet awe, separate from the clamor around her. The band launched into a familiar rhythm, the drum beat thundering through the floor, the guitar slicing a trail of sound straight into Jessica's chest. She found herself unconsciously humming along, her voice catching in the back of her throat, trembling with excitement. Every lyric, every note felt as though it were speaking directly to her, as if Elvis had somehow known of her long journey, the struggles of her family, the impossible hope that had carried her here. Then came a sudden, magical pause. The lights dimmed to a soft, intimate glow, and Elvis's gaze swept the crowd. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch, the notes lingering in the air like a secret. And then, his eyes locked on hers. Jessica gasped, her knees weak, her fingers gripping her mother's hand until it ached. She was the only one he seemed to see. The roar of the audience faded to a low murmur, the world narrowing to the space between them. "Hey there, little lady," he said, his voice carrying over the speakers, yet intimate, as though he were standing right beside her. The warmth in his tone, the effortless charm, made Jessica's chest swell with a mix of awe and disbelief. "What's your favorite song?" Jessica's voice trembled. "Love me tender," she whispered, tears welling in her blue eyes. She hardly dared to breathe, afraid that speaking might shatter the fragile bubble that had formed around her. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift. There was a hush, an anticipatory silence that made her ears ring with the intensity of the moment. Elvis knelt slightly on the stage, bringing himself to her level in spirit, if not in stature, and smiled. Genuine, warm, unassuming. The soft spotlight seemed to settle on Jessica, illuminating her face, her ribbon in her hair, the wide-eyed wonder that mirrored his own youthful energy from decades past. "All right, then," he said, and the band resumed, gentle notes threading through the air. "Let's sing it together." Jessica's voice joined his, tentative at first, shaking with every syllable, yet gradually finding courage in the comfort of his presence. The juxtaposition of her soft, fragile tone against the richness of his voice created a harmony that drew gasps and cheers from the crowd. She could feel the vibrations of the music under her feet, hear the collective heartbeat of the audience in rhythm with her own. The connection was electric, a tether that tied her not only to the song but to a man who, moments ago, had seemed untouchable, distant, larger than life. As the song reached its crescendo, Jessica felt herself standing on a threshold she hadn't known existed. The tears streaming down her face were no longer just from joy. They were a mingling of wonder, disbelief, and a profound sense of belonging. The applause rose to a deafening crescendo as the final note lingered in the hall. And for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the magic of the impossible realized. And then, in the quiet that followed the storm, Elvis leaned closer to her. His smile was conspiratorial, intimate, a secret shared across the expanse of the stage and the rows of chairs between them. Jessica didn't understand everything he said at first, but she caught the warmth, the encouragement, and the quiet reverence. In that whisper, she felt a promise, a seed planted that would grow long after the lights went out. The song ended, yet the spell remained. Jessica sat, trembling, her chest rising and falling as she tried to process what had just happened. The audience erupted into standing applause, yet she remained rooted, eyes wide, absorbing every moment, every sparkle of sequins, every heartbeat of the music. In that instant, she was no longer just a girl from a small southern town. She was part of something extraordinary, a story that would live within her forever. Margaret could barely speak, tears streaming down her cheeks. She gripped Jessica tightly, her mind racing to process the miraculous scene unfolding before them. This was more than a concert. It was a turning point, a memory etched in gold. the kind that would define the rest of their lives. Jessica's heart pounded as the music continued around her. She knew that what she had just experienced was unique, that the universe had conspired to place her here, in this moment, at this exact second. And as she looked back at Elvis, kneeling on the stage, his eyes still searching for hers, she realized that something extraordinary had begun. A connection that would resonate far beyond the music, far beyond the stage, and into the very core of her being. The applause still thundered in the hall, yet for Jessica it had become nothing more than a distant echo. All her attention was fixed on Elvis. His white jumpsuit sparkled under the stage lights, sequins catching and scattering the gold beams in an almost hypnotic way. But what truly held her gaze was not the shimmer or the fame. It was the warmth in his eyes, the way he leaned slightly toward her, acknowledging her presence as if she were the only person in the entire arena. Then, with a gentle hand extended, he beckoned. "Come on up here, little lady," he said, and the words pierced through the haze of disbelief like a sudden, bright ray of sun. Jessica froze, her small frame rigid, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she was sure he could hear it. The hall's roar seemed to fade entirely, leaving only the delicate, trembling pulse of her own anticipation. Margaret's hands were on her shoulders in a protective, almost desperate gesture, murmuring, "It's okay, baby. You can do this." But Jessica felt her feet moving before her mind could protest. Step by tentative step, she crossed the aisle, every inch a journey into a world she had only dreamed of in whispers, tucked away in the small bedroom she shared with her little sister. The stage rose higher with each movement, yet Jessica felt as if she were floating. Her legs wobbled, but his outstretched hand remained steady, grounding her in a surreal but undeniably real moment. The band paused, holding the final echo of the song, and the entire hall seemed suspended in midair, collective breaths held, waiting to see what would happen next. "Right here," Elvis said, guiding her to the microphone. His voice, calm yet commanding, resonated with reassurance. "Don't be scared. Sing with me." Jessica swallowed hard. The microphone felt enormous in her small hands, cold metal against her trembling fingers. Her pulse raced, and for a moment she considered running back to the safety of her mother's arms. But then she looked up, met his gaze, and saw a smile that was more than celebrity charm. It was understanding, compassion, recognition. That smile gave her courage. And so she sang. Her voice wavered, a thin, fragile thread at first, blending with the notes that he guided effortlessly from the speakers. "Love me tender," she whispered, her lips quivering, yet the melody found its way into the crowd, soft and unassuming but full of raw, unfiltered emotion. She closed her eyes, allowing the music to take over, to carry her. Every note she sang was not just a sound, it was a heartbeat, a story, a connection to the journey that had led her here. Elvis leaned closer, his voice weaving in around hers, gently, without overpowering. The combination of his seasoned, velvety tones and her tentative, trembling pitch created a harmony that seemed impossible, yet utterly real. Gasps and soft cries rose from the audience, some moved to tears, others silent in awe, but all united in witnessing this improbable, fragile, luminous moment. She felt his presence like a shield, a warmth surrounding her, giving her strength she didn't know she had. The notes wrapped around her small frame, each syllable a reassurance, each pause a heartbeat shared with someone she had idolized from afar. For Jessica, the music ceased to be just sound. It became language, and Elvis was speaking directly to her, the words threading through the spaces between the notes. You matter. You belong. You can dream. The crescendo built, and the audience rose as one, clapping, stomping, voices raised in ecstatic celebration. Jessica's voice grew bolder, stronger, more confident with every line, her small hands tightening around the microphone, anchoring her. For the first time, she felt the immense, intoxicating joy of being seen, recognized, and celebrated. Not as a child, not as a fan, but as a participant in something far greater than herself. As the final chords rang out, Elvis bent down and whispered in her ear. The words were soft, almost too soft for anyone else to hear. But Jessica understood immediately. Her eyes widened, tears spilling down her cheeks. The secret words, meant only for her, were an affirmation she would carry forever. She nodded vigorously, clutching the microphone like a treasure. The crowd erupted into applause again, but this time Jessica barely noticed. She was wrapped in the glow of an unforgettable intimacy, a moment where a superstar became more than just a figure on stage. He became a guide, a beacon, a messenger of dreams made real. She looked at her mother in the wings. Margaret's eyes mirrored her own, wide with disbelief, overflowing with tears of joy and pride. Elvis stood, letting her take a breath, watching as the young girl processed the enormity of what had just occurred. Then he gave a small, conspiratorial nod, a silent pact between them, as if to say, "This is just the beginning." The stage lights dimmed slightly, returning focus to the band, but Jessica remained in a bubble, suspended between reality and magic, knowing that this night would be etched into her memory in a way nothing else ever could. For a moment, the world seemed still. Music, applause, and the weight of thousands of voices faded into a blur. All that remained was the warmth of a hand on hers, a voice guiding her, and the realization that life, her life, had just changed forever. Jessica would never forget the sensation of singing beside Elvis, the tremor of her own voice meeting his, the soft whisper of encouragement that would echo in her heart for the rest of her days. In that single moment, she understood the truth she had only glimpsed in daydreams. Miracles, no matter how improbable, could be real. And for her, this was only the beginning of an extraordinary journey. The roar of the audience had barely faded when Jessica and her mother, still trembling from the thrill of the performance, were guided backstage. The narrow corridors smelled faintly of perfume, polish, and something indefinably glamorous, a mix of energy and anticipation that clung to the walls. Margaret clutched Jessica's hand tightly, her knuckles white, as if trying to anchor both of them in a reality that felt increasingly surreal. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency, as if they were part of a living, breathing machine that had one goal: to make the impossible feel inevitable. Jessica's small feet seemed to barely touch the floor, her mind racing faster than she could breathe. Every shadow, every door, every muffled sound hinted at secrets and wonders, and she felt herself on the edge of discovering something extraordinary. Finally, they reached a softly lit room, and there he was, not the flashing, spotlighted figure from the stage, not the image in magazines, not the idol of millions, but a man quietly leaning against a table, casually elegant, yet fully present. His eyes held the same warmth she had felt moments before under the stage lights, but now there was a closeness, an intimacy that made her catch her breath. It was Elvis, simply and profoundly himself. He smiled gently at her, gesturing for them to sit. "I wanted to meet the girl who sang 'Love Me Tender' tonight," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. a stark contrast to the roar and energy of the stage. Jessica barely dared to speak, her lips parting slightly, only to close again, unsure how to respond. Margaret, usually composed, found herself stumbling over words, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if trying to anchor herself to a moment that seemed too wondrous to exist. Elvis's gaze settled on Jessica, with a tenderness that silenced every fear she had carried. "I heard your voice," he said, softly but firmly, "and I wanted you to know that it's something special. Never let it go." Then he moved to a small table, picking up a simple cassette tape. Jessica's eyes followed the movement, her heart quickening. He turned to her and handed it over, holding it with the care one might reserve for a fragile treasure. Written on the tape in bold, precise handwriting were the words, "For Jessica, with all my love, Elvis." Jessica's fingers trembled as she accepted the gift. It wasn't just a cassette. It wasn't just a recording of music. It was a tangible piece of the man she admired, a piece of magic, a piece of belief that someone had seen her, understood her, and had chosen to honor her in a way that no words, no money, no ordinary gift could ever match. Tears brimmed in her eyes, hot and unstoppable, and she clutched the tape to her chest as if holding it too lightly might shatter its power. Margaret leaned closer, her own voice trembling. "Jessica, it's real. He really did this for you." Elvis shook his head gently. "It's real, but not because of me. It's real because of her," he said, nodding toward Jessica. "She reminded me why I started singing in the first place, why we all need music, hope, and a little bit of belief that dreams can come true." For the first time since the concert began, Jessica felt a profound quiet settle over her. The chaos of flashing lights, cheering fans, and pounding music fell away. There was only the room, the tape in her hands, and the extraordinary human presence of a man who had touched millions, but had chosen, in this fleeting instant, to touch her life directly. Elvis leaned in slightly, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that carried both reassurance and challenge. "I want you to remember this, Jessica. Life will ask a lot of you, but never doubt your own voice. Never doubt your own light. Keep it shining, no matter how dark it seems around you." Jessica nodded, her tears spilling freely now, unrestrained, each one carrying a mixture of awe, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of possibility. Her mother's hands rested lightly on her shoulders, steady and grounding, but even Margaret's breath hitched at the weight of the moment. Then, as if to cement the magic even further, Elvis paused and looked at Margaret. "I think it's only fair that she, and her family, have the chance to experience more of this," he said. "We'll make sure you can come to all my shows in your state. This isn't just a one-night thing. Let her dreams stretch farther than she's imagined." Margaret's mouth fell open, words caught somewhere between disbelief and elation. Jessica could barely comprehend the enormity of what she was hearing. All around them, the room seemed to glow, as though the walls themselves were recognizing the profound human connection taking place. The moment stretched, suspended in a rare, almost sacred silence, a space where the weight of fame and the simplicity of human kindness collided in a way that felt eternal. Jessica's small hand brushed the tape, feeling not just plastic and tape, but a tangible thread to hope, courage, and the belief that miracles, if even fleeting, were possible. Elvis offered her one last smile, warm and quiet, almost conspiratorial, before gently nodding toward the door. "Go on now, live, sing, and remember tonight. And maybe one day you'll share this magic with someone else." As Jessica and her mother were led back toward the corridors, that would return them to the world outside, the tape clutched to her chest, she realized something profound. She wasn't just leaving with a gift of music, or even with memories of a concert. She was leaving with a tangible proof that the universe sometimes bends in favor of the courageous, the pure of heart, the dreamers who dare to believe. In that room, in those quiet moments, away from the screaming crowd, Jessica's life had been irrevocably altered. Not by fame, or money, or spectacle, but by the simple, profound power of being truly seen and believed in by someone who had the entire world at his fingertips. That gift, far beyond the cassette or the moment, was something she would carry for the rest of her life. The hallways behind the stage were dimly lit, soft carpet muffling their footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of coffee, polished wood, and the lingering scent of flowers, tributes from fans who had filled the venue hours before. Jessica clutched the cassette like a fragile treasure, her small hands trembling, but it was the words he had whispered moments ago that refused to leave her mind. Elvis motioned for them to sit again, this time in a corner filled with quiet, where the hum of backstage activity softened into background noise. He leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees, eyes meeting hers with a gravity that carried more weight than the stage had ever shown. "Jessica," he began, his voice steady and sincere, "what you did tonight, singing with me, wasn't just for me or for the people in the crowd. It was for you. And I want you to remember something, long after tonight is gone." Her mother, Margaret, stood slightly behind, silent, almost frozen, afraid to interrupt the gravity of the moment. The only sound was the faint shuffling of stagehands and the low buzz of equipment cooling after the concert's relentless energy. "I've seen a lot in my life," Elvis continued. "A lot of people who have been told they couldn't, wouldn't, or shouldn't. People laughed at me, told me my voice wasn't enough, that I didn't fit anywhere. But here's the truth, Jessica. It's not the laughter or the doubts that define you. It's what you do with them. What you choose to believe when the world says no. That's the difference between those who just dream and those who truly live their dreams." Jessica felt a warmth spreading through her chest, a mix of awe and understanding. She nodded slowly, the words sinking in, each one a seed planted deep in the soil of her imagination. She could feel, in that intimate quiet, the power of belief growing, fragile yet unstoppable. Elvis reached out, placing a hand gently on hers, a small, grounding gesture that carried a profound weight. "Never stop believing in your voice, Jessica. Never let anyone make you feel that your dreams are too big, too impossible, or too foolish. You have something inside you that can shine brighter than anything you'll see on a stage, brighter than anyone can ever tell you is possible. And it starts with this: trust yourself." Her lips trembled as tears filled her eyes, not the loud, uncontrolled tears from the concert, but quiet, deep ones that spoke of awe, gratitude, and the realization that life could be bigger than she had ever imagined. Margaret wiped her own eyes discreetly, feeling a swell of pride and disbelief. They were in the presence of a man who could have been just a distant icon, but he had chosen instead to speak directly to the heart of a child, and by doing so, to change the trajectory of her life. Elvis smiled softly, almost shyly, as if the enormity of his own words surprised him. "I want you to take this with you," he said, gesturing to the cassette she still held. "Not just as a memory of tonight, but as a reminder. Every time you hear these songs, remember that someone who's been where you are, believes in you. That's the secret. The world can be loud, scary, and confusing. But your voice, your heart, your dreams, they belong to you, and no one can take them away." Jessica blinked back tears, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. She could feel the weight of responsibility mingling with hope, the kind of hope that fills your soul with energy and possibility. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about courage, resilience, and the faith to believe in herself even when circumstances seemed impossible. "And," Elvis added, lowering his voice almost conspiratorially, "you're not alone. You've got people who care, who will help you, who will open doors when you need them. Your family, your friends, and, well, sometimes even strangers who see the spark in your eyes." Just then, one of his assistants appeared, quietly holding a small envelope. Elvis took it, opened it, and handed it to Margaret. "For you two," he said, voice calm. "Consider it an invitation to see more than just tonight. You'll have VIP access to all my shows in your state. Not because you asked, not because it's easy, but because I know how important these moments can be. I want her to have a chance to keep dreaming. Over and over." Margaret's hands shook as she accepted the envelope, tears now freely streaming down her face. Jessica clutched the cassette tightly, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief, joy, and gratitude. This wasn't just a gift. It was a key, a door opening to a life she had never dared to imagine. The room seemed to glow around them, the lights soft, almost reverent, as though the walls themselves acknowledged the significance of the moment. Jessica looked up at Elvis, and through the haze of tears, she managed to whisper, I'll never forget this. Ever." He leaned back slightly, eyes glimmering with a mixture of pride and gentleness. "I know you won't," he said. "And when you grow up, when you face challenges and doubts, remember this. The world doesn't define you. Your dreams do, and I'll always believe in yours." For a long moment, they simply sat together, the noise of the backstage fading into a distant hum, leaving just the quiet power of words, trust, and belief. Jessica understood then that this night wasn't just about music or fame or a performance. It was about the human connections that shape us, that lift us when the world seems heavy, that plant the seeds of courage and hope deep within our hearts. She pressed the cassette to her chest once more, tears still falling, and felt a profound shift. From this night forward, she knew that even if the world mocked her dreams, even if obstacles rose higher than she could see, she carried something infinitely more powerful than doubt. The unwavering belief of someone who had once dared to dream himself, and who had chosen to pass that courage forward to her. The morning after the concert, the town of Memphis seemed to hum with a quiet excitement that hadn't existed before. Word had traveled faster than anyone could have predicted. By breakfast time, neighbors were exchanging glances over coffee cups, whispers of astonishment spilling into the streets. "Did you hear about the girl who sang with Elvis?" People stopped mid-step on the sidewalks, nodding to one another as though they were all in on a shared secret, a miracle witnessed the night before. Inside the small home that Jessica and Margaret returned to, the atmosphere was both ordinary and extraordinary. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the modest furniture and the homemade curtains stitched with care by Margaret. Jessica's fingers kept tracing the edges of the cassette, a gift more precious than any jewel. On the counter, the envelope from Elvis sat slightly open, revealing tickets for every upcoming concert in their state. Margaret's hands shook as she carefully stacked the envelopes, still unable to believe that this life-changing night had truly occurred. As the family settled into the day, the doorbell rang repeatedly. Curious neighbors and distant relatives had heard about the story, and stopped by to congratulate them. Children pressed their faces against the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jessica, the girl who had sung with the king of rock and roll. Newspapers and local radio stations were already buzzing. One reporter had come with a tape recorder, politely asking if they could record Jessica's story for a segment on the morning news. Even strangers, inspired by the story, were sending letters, small notes, and drawings, expressing awe, encouragement, and their own dreams. Each letter carried a piece of hope, a ripple effect sparked by a single extraordinary moment. Jessica, who had spent the previous day lost in awe and tears, now felt a quiet sense of responsibility. She sat on the edge of her bed, cassette in hand, and played the recording over and over. The familiar voice of Elvis filled the room, but it was more than music. It was guidance, affirmation, and a reminder that even the smallest voices could resonate beyond their immediate surroundings. She whispered to herself, words she didn't fully understand yet, but felt deeply, "I can do this. I can dream bigger." Margaret watched her daughter, heart swelling with pride and tears she could no longer contain. She realized that the night's events were far more than a magical encounter. They were a turning point. Jessica's courage had been recognized and nurtured, and now the small home in a quiet southern town was a beacon of possibility. For Margaret, it was both inspiring and humbling to witness her daughter's innocence transform into quiet, unstoppable determination. The news continued to spread beyond Memphis. By mid-morning, phone calls were coming from all over the state. People wanted to know more about the girl who had dared to sing with Elvis on stage. Invitations to local television programs, radio interviews, and even a few feature articles began to arrive. Jessica and Margaret faced a flood of attention, and though overwhelming, it carried a certain warmth, a collective joy from strangers who had been touched by a pure, unfiltered moment of human connection. The cassette remained the anchor of the experience. At night, Jessica would sit by her small record player, close her eyes, and let the familiar rhythms wash over her. Each note of Elvis's voice seemed to carry with it a quiet encouragement, as if he were there beside her in the dim glow of her bedroom, whispering the same words: "Trust yourself. Keep dreaming. Keep believing." She began humming along, gaining confidence with every attempt, and slowly the shyness that had once defined her started to melt away. Margaret noticed the transformation immediately. Jessica's schoolwork became more confident, her interactions with other children more assertive. But beyond the tangible changes, there was an intangible shift, a light in her eyes, a calm certainty that the impossible could, in fact, be possible. Even the smallest tasks seemed infused with meaning, as if every day were now an opportunity to honor the trust and encouragement she had received from someone who had once been just a distant, unreachable icon. A week after the concert, the family received a personal note from Elvis himself. It was short, handwritten, and heartfelt. "Jessica, you have something rare. Keep it safe, keep it alive, and let it grow. Remember that the world is bigger than fear, and your voice is stronger than doubt. Love, Elvis." Margaret held the letter to her chest while Jessica stared at it wide-eyed, the words sinking deep into her heart. It wasn't just a note. It was a mandate, a guiding light for the years to come. Even months later, the story retained its magic. Letters kept arriving, friends of friends wrote to share their own hopes and dreams, and Jessica became, in her own quiet way, a symbol of courage and belief. It wasn't about fame. It was about hope, about the extraordinary power of one night to alter the course of a life. Jessica learned to greet every morning with a sense of purpose, a sense of possibility, and an understanding that sometimes the universe, or perhaps fate, places incredible opportunities in the hands of those who dare to believe. In her quiet room, listening to the cassette, Jessica closed her eyes. The warm hum of the record player blended with the echo of that unforgettable night. She remembered Elvis's words, the way he had looked into her eyes, the gentle firmness of his encouragement. And in that moment, she understood something profound, that for him it had been just one evening on stage. But for her, it had been a lifetime reshaped in the space of a few magical minutes. The sun set outside, casting a golden glow through the window, illuminating the small room with its soft warmth. Jessica held the cassette to her heart, feeling the promise of a future that had suddenly expanded beyond the boundaries of her imagination. She whispered the words he had spoken, as if sealing them into her very being. "I can dream. I can believe. I can do anything." And in that small southern town, in that quiet house filled with love and hope, a girl's life had been forever changed by a single, unforgettable night. And the legacy of that moment would ripple through her life, and countless others, for years to come. The music played on, and Jessica's dreams, once fragile and distant, had finally found the courage to soar.